You hear this between the crackle, a voice picked clean by static and time. I keep the transmitter warm because someone, somewhere, might still be listening. Let me tell you what the world looks like now, while the generator hums and the night presses close. The sky stopped pretending to be kind a long time ago. It's a bruise most days, a low, angry purple that never quite lets the sun finish its sentence. When the wind comes, it smells like burnt paper and salt, as if the ocean learned how to burn and the cities learned how to drown. Seasons bent and snapped. Winters came too hot. Summers came like a furnace with teeth. Rain arrives in fits and rages, turning streets into rivers that swallow cars and memories, or it doesn't come at all, leaving the land to crack and make its own sound. The maps we used to trust were redrawn by fire and water. Rivers you learned to curse as a kid are now ragged scars of salty soil, or sudden torrents that flash and take whole neighborhoods with them. The skyline, once a promise of glass and light, reads now like a list of ruins. The towers lean like confessing men. Bridges hang by rusted threads. Where there used to be neon and advertisements telling you what to want, there are skeletal billboards flickering with old faces. I drove past an airport last year. The runways folded in on themselves like paper boats. I walked through a mall where mannequins still wore bright dresses no one will ever buy again. Nature didn't so much reclaim the world as it rearranged it. Wildfires moved like armies with merciless discipline, sweeping across suburbs, leaving only chimneys and the hard black bones of trees. In other places, the land has turned to dust so fine it gets into your lungs and settles there like a second silence. Cities near coasts learn to disappear slowly, edges eaten by the sea, basements full of things that should have stayed buried. Farther north, permafrost turned traitor and the ground came apart like old plaster. The rules we lived by broke, all of them at once. And then the nights changed. They stretched. They went on longer than they were meant to. Street lamps burn less and people close their doors earlier, not because of curfew, but because the dark learned to listen. That's when the rumors started, not the kind you can fact-check, but the kind that breed between hearths and in the silence of abandoned subways. The nights became clever. They learned patterns. They learned where we put our fear. Government, as we remember it, folded quietly, then all at once. There were decrees and sirens and promises on television that stopped being made in any language we trusted. Supply chains unraveled into caravans that either never returned or came back hollow and quieter. What remained of institutions, hospitals, police precincts, the academies, became either shelters or fortresses, or they fell and were scavenged for parts. Hospitals ran on hope, and then on whatever batteries and drugs could be looted from their rooms. Police became local militias. Militias became governors of their own small rules. Where once there were municipal halls, there are now message boards nailed to lampposts. Lists of names, warnings, pleas. Humanity reorganized itself around what it could carry. There are caravans now, long, ragged trains of vehicles and donkeys and bicycles, all lashed together with rope and history. They trade for gasoline like it's religion. There are settlements that keep to themselves, with watchtowers and rope bridges and codes hammered into knives. Some clans wear bandanas of color to say who they are. Some paint symbols on doors to tell whether you're friend or something to be shot on sight. Scavengers move at dawn, when thermals confuse the keenest eyes, looting libraries for paper and hospitals for saline. And then there are the ones who answer only to hunger, raiders who take without asking and leave without trace. The economy isn't money anymore. It's water, fuel, pharmaceuticals, and memory. A clean liter of water will buy you a night under a guarded roof. An old book will buy you a story at a fire. Schools are fewer than wells. Churches, too, are either sanctuaries of comfort or caches for medicine. The internet survives in pockets, little islands of code kept alive by people who still believe knowledge is worth preserving. Radio is one of those islands. It's cheap, it's hardy, and it still carries the human voice farther than a flame. Institutions that could coordinate, large hospitals, nationalized power grids, scientific core tried and failed in pieces. There are still laboratories with half-functioning equipment and journals behind locked doors. And some people still cling to the idea that if you put the right light on the right problem, the problem will answer. Mostly, though, science is practiced in the spaces between survival tasks. A man in a basement testing water quality, a woman trying to plant salt-tolerant crops in a parking lot. We experiment with grit and plastic and hope. And people, you and I and the others, we learned habits fast. We learned to listen for footsteps that were wrong, to trust the sound of a radio more than the sight of a light. We learned to keep our names short and private, to carry stories like pocket knives. We barter, we lie sometimes, we help sometimes. We build walls and leave doors open a crack. Anxiety is our shadow companion. It follows us in the quiet and sits with us at night, a constant tremor we try not to call by name. So that's the map I can draw for you across the static. A planet scorched, flooded, and stitched back together with desperation. Landmarks are riddled with new meanings. Cities are cemeteries with echoes. Governments have become local bargains. Survival is a skill set, but more than that, it's an attitude, a refusal to let the night do all the talking. If you're listening, keep your frequency low and your lights lower. Keep warm, keep quiet, and keep your story ready. The world is not the world we were taught. It's the one we're trying to learn how to live in again. I'll be here when the static thins, same time, same frequency. They gave me a name once that fit on a business card and sounded like someone who paid his taxes on time. Miles Harrington. It's small enough that it rolls off the tongue. But here, in the hum of wires and the smell of burned rubber and coffee, names stretch and fray. I announce Miles when I sign on, because a voice without a name is only static pretending to be a person. Saying it feels ceremonial. It reminds me I used to matter to other things besides survival. Before the nights grew long and clever, I worked in radio for real. Not this makeshift thing at the edge of a ruined town with a patched antenna and a generator that coughs like an old man. I had a slot, a small audience, a laugh that fit the late evening. I interviewed authors, read the weather without the weight of the apocalypse on my shoulders, and my daughter used to curl at my feet while I read the papers into the microphone. Now my audience is smaller, my questions crueler, and the news I read is ledgered in losses. What I do is broadcast. That's the short version. I keep the transmitter alive, which means I spend half my waking hours tending to a box of parts that used to be ordinary. A hand-crank generator, a solar rag the size of a blanket, a stack of deep cycle batteries scavenged from hospital UPS units and abandoned telecom relays. I've learned to fix things I never wanted to learn how to fix: soldering, winding coils, splicing rusted wire with copper stolen from street signs. I have a map of frequencies tucked under a sheet of plexiglass. When I turn the knob and hear another human voice, something inside me steadies. Survival is a series of small humiliations and stubborn acts of care. I water the rooftop garden, 3 plastic barrels of rainwater filtered through layers of cloth and charcoal. I teach seeds to remember what green is supposed to be. I trade batteries for antibiotics at a settlement 3 towns over. When I go out, I wear layers and carry a scavenger's satchel with rope, a flare, a folding saw, and a canteen that tastes faintly of old diesel because fuel is distilled hope. I avoid the main roads unless I have to. They are the places where one can be seen from too far away. You learn to move where light and sound will not betray you. There's craft in radio that's useful for life. You listen first, you repeat less, and you learn to give people what they need without promising what you can't deliver. I listen to other frequencies like a doctor listens to an old wound gently, looking for signs of infection. There's a woman on 88.7 who sings to herself into the night. Sometimes she tells me where the safe wells are. There's a boy who calls himself Reed and sends codes about a patrol of raiders 3 miles out. We trade information, and with it, we trade the illusion of being many and organized. Information here is currency, and sometimes it keeps someone alive for another dawn. Why do I keep going? That question sits heavy in the quiet between my sentences. On most days it is a geometry of small things. A coffee I can still make with ground beans I barter for, the sound of a bird that somehow survived, the way my voice sounds over the radio when I laugh. But there is a deeper contour to it, responsibility. When the world folded, the radio towers did not die all at once. Some of us kept breathing into the microphones because it was the only way to be an anchor. People listen. People plan. They move toward sound, the way moths move toward a candle. If I stop, their map of where safety might be narrows a little more. And then there's her. I keep a photograph in my pocket, creased, faded at the edges. My girl, Elise, hair a rebellious thing in sunlight that used to be abundant. She fell ill the year the nights changed. And in the vacuum of failing hospitals and looted clinics, the outbreak took her in a way no science could answer at the time. The word vampire didn't comfort me then, and it doesn't now. It's too mythic for the rational hurt I carry. But whatever the mechanism was, the blood-borne mutations, the altered circadian collapse, whatever, I couldn't save her. If I ever stop broadcasting, it will feel like I stopped saying her name into the world. So I speak, because to keep a voice alive is to keep memory alive. Loss has retooled me into someone who hoards rituals. Every night I wind the crank 3 full turns before I switch the transmitter on. I read names from the logbook, a litany of people I met once over static and then never again. I keep a list taped to the inside of the console. Supplies, frequencies, the names of the settlements that still trade. Rituals make the world predictable when nothing else will. When the generator chokes, I press my palms flat on the metal as if to warm its heart. When I get back from a run, I always wash the dust from my hands and say the names of the places I passed. You can call it superstition if you like. I call it a maintenance schedule for a fragile mind. Struggle is civic around here. I am not a lone island. I'm a node in a ragged mesh. I learned early that trust is calibrated in small doses. There are people I would risk my life for, and there are people whom I would hand over a battery with a coin flip and a prayer. There was a time I let someone into my compound because his story was compelling, and his face seemed tired in the same way I was tired. He stayed 3 nights and left with a box of antibiotics and my old wristwatch. I still chalk it up as one of my failures, the measure of how much hope you can afford to give away before it becomes a liability. Violence is never the dramatic spectacle that fiction imagines. It's practical, ugly, and quick. I have had to defend the rooftop garden with a crowbar, and once, in a warehouse half a mile down the rail yard, I watched 2 men argue over a can of baby formula until one of them made the wrong step and the argument ended with a broken neck. Those are the lessons that teach patience. Never turn your back too fast, and never be surprised by the coldness of a body that used to be warm. There are scars that are not on the skin. I sleep with the radio on low because silence is an accusation. Sometimes I dream of the city before smoke and salt, and I wake with the taste of old traffic and a clenched jaw. I have nightmares that repeat like a faulty loop on a vinyl record. Elise calling through the static in a voice I cannot parse. A recorded message from a hospital saying the wards are closed. And always, always, the image of a street lamp blowing out, and something moving into the dark where the light used to be. And yet there are moments that shape-shift into something like grace. Once, a caravan rolled by and left behind a small crate of vintage records. I set up an old phonograph and played a lazy jazz tune into the night. For a scant hour, lights in 3 distant buildings blinked on. Someone else was listening. The music stitched us with an invisible thread. These are the receipts of living, the proof that beauty still has reasons to show up in the world. I will not pretend to be brave in a romantic sense. Most of my bravery is slow. It's waking up. It's walking the same path over broken glass. It's deciding not to answer a frequency that sounds like a trap. There are days I count my breaths like prayers. There are days I want to stop, to let the transmitter eat cigarette-length seconds of silence and never cough again. But the thing about being on the air is this. Once you speak into a room of strangers and name a place, that place becomes less imaginary. It becomes a point in someone else's map. It becomes, for a sliver of time, a promise. So I keep a log. I keep the crystals in the receiver cleaned. I tune out the frequencies that offer only doom and tune into the ones that hum with the possibility of kitchen gardens and undiscovered wells. I am a cartographer of the living and the dying. I draw borders with sentences, and I chart the weather with the cadence of my voice. If this section of the night ends with nothing but static and a small, polite silence, I will still have broadcasted. That matters. Maybe it will not bring Elise back. Maybe it will not turn back the long cleverness of the dark. But someone, somewhere, will press their ear to a radio and find in my voice the faint shape of company. That is why I keep my station warm. That is why my hands know the positions of every knob like the lines of an old map. I am a teller of coordinates now, of wells, of raider patrols, of who's left in the bakery on 5th. I am the voice a small child might whisper into the night when she cannot sleep. I sign on and sign off like a benediction. Miles Harrington, frequency 103.1, signing off. I do it with the same care I used to put into reading the weather. The words are small. The meaning is enormous. I turn the dial down. I wind the crank twice, and I lay my head not because I can sleep, but because sleep is a thing humans still attempt. An attempt is a kind of resistance. Tomorrow I will patch another antenna, trade for another battery, maybe climb the tower if the wind is kind. Tomorrow I will speak into the night again, because the alternative is to become a silence that teaches no one how to remember. You hear me because I kept the transmitter warm, because I learned to braid hope into the wiring. Tonight I'm telling you what is coming down on us, and why the small comforts we'd been scraping together are slipping like wet sand through our fingers. This is not one single thing that ate the world. It's a dozen bad things happening at once, and each one is hand in glove with the next. Listen close. The map of danger matters more than the map of memory right now. It started, as these things do, with weather that would not behave. Winters that arrived soft and wet instead of cold, then burned off with a heat that smelled like old rubber. Rivers that used to slow and breathe instead thinned into angry channels of silt and salt. Then the seasons stopped being seasons. There were years when the rain came as drowning storms and years when it didn't come at all. On top of that, the atmosphere changed its mood. Sun that should have warmed the skin began to falter like a tired heart. The light shortened. Night stretched, then settled in like an animal that had decided it, like the couch. When the sunlight failed to do what sunlight is supposed to do, keep the nights honest and keep the balance in our bodies and ecosystems, other systems started to unravel. Crops need cycles. Insects need cycles. Even the microbes that break down waste need cycles. With the cycles disrupted, soil that once produced food lost its rhythm. Plant diseases thrived in the wrong humidity. Pollinators dwindled. Fisheries collapsed because plankton woke and slept on a bad schedule, and the nets came back full of slime instead of fish. The direct science of it has a neat vocabulary. Albedo shifts, jet stream wobble, feedback loops. The ice and the heat started to talk to each other and agreed they didn't need us very much. Forests dried into a line of tinder. When the fires came, they moved like a thought. And when the permafrost thawed in some places, old things that were safely buried were set loose. Microbes, gases, compounds none of the modern headlines were prepared to name. I'm not a scientist on paper, but I have learned a vocabulary that helps me tell a story that doesn't terrify people into silence. Words like feedback mean we are not merely suffering one-off events. They mean the system that used to buffer us is breaking down. Into that broken world came another disaster, something at once biological and behaviorally strange. Whatever it was, and we have too many names for it depending on who's telling the story, it changed people. It rewired some of their nights, made them hungrier in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. It is bloodborne in many cases. It is transmitted by bites, by wounds, by bodies that shed contagion in the wrong places. But it also feeds on the change to the environment. Longer nights, colder sun, people pushed into cramped quarters. The pathogen, if that is what it is, found a niche in the twilight and multiplied. It turned some who were sick into hunters of the dark. I use the old word vampire because that is the shorthand people reach for when they are scared and need a monster with a name. But don't mistake the myth for the mechanism. These aren't capes and polished fangs. They are infected survivors who move when the light fails, who are quicker in the cold, and who become more dangerous as darkness lengthens. The climate collapse made our nights longer, and the nights gave the outbreak the time it needed to evolve and to practice. Survival is getting harder for a dozen reasons you could name in a single breath. The obvious ones, water, fuel, food, are finite and being used faster than they can be replaced. Wells that used to sit in town squares are salted or poisoned by runoff. Pumps that ran on municipal power were abandoned when the grid failed. The backup generators that remain are either in hands that want to keep them secret or in workshops where no one knows how to fix them. Fuel is a currency you cannot print. Once it's gone, nothing moves. Batteries hold days and sometimes weeks of life for a transmitter, but they drain, sulfide, and die if you overdraw them. I learned to ration cycles. A deep cycle battery can be drawn down a certain percentage safely, but my point is this. Every charge you use tonight is a charge you may not have tomorrow. That is the arithmetic of scarcity, and it is indifferent to how much courage you muster. Food is a slow burn problem. Gardens can be grown on rooftops if you have soil and a way to keep saline spray from killing the seedlings. I know people who have coaxed tomatoes out of sacks of potting soil dug from parking lots, who water with cloth-filtered rain. But training plants to survive in salt-laced dust takes time and seeds are now traded like contraband. Fishing is a memory in many places because the plankton and small fish behaved differently when the thermocline shifted. Livestock fell to disease, and where herds remain, they are guarded like nuclear relics. Water is not just scarce, it is unreliable. Runoff from burned hillsides carries ash and chemicals into reservoirs. Contamination is a daily threat. Practically, that means you need filtration, chemical treatment, and heat. Filter through cloth, then sand, then charcoal, slow it down, remove particulates. Boil when you can. If you can spare the time and plastic bottles, solar disinfection works. Fill clear bottles and leave them in the light. These are low-tech, practical steps that save people more often than miracles do. We teach these techniques over the radio sometimes, because a neighbor can hear and fix a method before a thirst becomes fatal. Beyond the material limits, there are human limits. Trust is a finite resource. People become more likely to steal, to lie, to conserve compassion in the same way they conserve water. Communities that were once open and noisy drew their blinds and kept their lights low. The social networks that once distributed help, municipal services, NGOs, supply chains, either folded or became predatory. In some places, militias took over because someone had to keep order. In others, the rule of law collapsed into the law of whoever could muster the most bullets. That fragmentation means that aid moves in fits and starts, depending on who is willing to share and who is not. Weather itself has become the antagonist. We get storms that come with little warning that saturate the ground after years of drought. And in those storms, the roads become rivers and bridges fail. We get acid rain in places where the air mixes with volatile compounds released by industrial fires, which strips paint and corrodes metal, and makes the simple act of finding shelter a riskier proposition for breathing. Wind events carry dust that is fine enough to slip through filters, so even the act of breathing can wear you down over time. Heat waves used to be seasonal. Now a heat spike can make a generator overheat, ruin electronics, and kill crops in a single week. Encounters with other survivors are mixed bags. There are the caravans who trade fairly. 2 batteries for a crate of antibiotics, and a handful of preserved beans. There are scouts who pass notes on frequencies with coordinates to wells and safe houses. There are rival factions that would rather keep a resource to themselves and leave entire towns to starve. I've been betrayed. I have also been rescued. There was a time I answered a low, cracked frequency and walked into a meeting where 3 people I'd thought were dead were crouched beneath a half-collapsed bell tower. They fed me soup. They told me stories. For a little while, life felt possible again. And then there are the hunters. Some infected have formed packs that move with cunning and ruthlessness, or maybe they are still people but their needs have shortened their patience for civility. They strike at night, as you might expect, but sometimes they strike at dusk and dawn when our vigilance is lowest. Raiders, human raiders, take advantage of the chaos, set up false beacons, pretend to be garbed caravans, and then pull you into an alley. The truth is, danger wears many faces now. You cannot assume any human is safe simply because their voice sounds tired. There are scientists out there still, working in abandoned labs with scavenged reagents, trying to map the contagion's genome, or at least its basic mechanics. I traded a week's worth of radio time to a pair of them once. They spoke in terms I used to read in magazines, and now try to translate for listeners. They hypothesized that a series of mutations altered receptors in the blood that control circadian-related hormones and metabolic pathways, making the infected more sensitive to low-light conditions, and more aggressive when their sleep cycles were disturbed. It sounded like jargon the way they explained it, but the upshot was simple. A destabilized environment gave a pathogen the room it needed to find a foothold, and then human movement and dense living quarters accelerated its spread. Actionable advice then: limit exposure at night. Use layers, not just for warmth but to make your skin less accessible to bites. Create redundant sleeping arrangements separated by a buffer zone if you live with a group. Keep wounds covered and clean. The first hours after a bite or injury matter most. If you must move at night, travel in a small, quiet group and use hand signals instead of lights. On the technical side, conserve battery cycles by running transmitters on a schedule, warm the transmitter, broadcast on a predictable cadence, and then sleep the device. Replace batteries when they are within a safe discharge range. Sulfation is a silent killer of deep cycle cells. If you can occasionally float charge them, do it. These are not glamorous tips, but they are the things that keep one more person alive. The psychological toll is cumulative. We are not just fatigued. We are living in a state of sustained, low-grade panic. People forget things, they snap at one another, they make choices that are cruel because they are terrified. Grief is everywhere, like rain in winter. The cost of that is a community losing its capacity to respond collectively to crises. Where we have cohesion, we can shore a place up. Where we have fragmentation, the place falls like an earthen wall. That is the crisis plan in a long, ragged paragraph. A changing climate that rewired ecosystems. A pathogen that thrives in the shadow of the climate change, fragile infrastructure, diminishing resources, human predation, and the psychological erosion of trust. Each of these magnifies the other. Every night that stretches longer is another chance for the outbreak to spread. Every shortage of fuel means fewer generators to run lights, which means more movement in the dark, which means more exposure. It is a calculus of interlocking failures. I tell you this because the practical matters, the how of it, offer a place to act, even if it's small. When you know the map of failure, you can choose a route that avoids it. Patch your radios, learn to filter water, barter intelligently, and above all, listen. The radio is a lifeline we can still throw across the void. It is how caravans learn where the safe wells are, how a trapped crew can be warned, how a mother can know another voice is still breathing in the dark. We cannot fix the entire climate tonight. We cannot end the biological collapse with a single broadcast, but we can teach each other the small, stubborn sciences of surviving until something larger changes. So I keep the frequency warm. I pass on coordinates when I can. I tell stories about the places that still have food and the people who will trade fairly. I warn about the nights when the landscape seems to hold its breath. And when I speak about the infected, I try not to turn them into monsters any more than they already are. They were human once. Many are human still in the small parts that remember names and songs. That nuance does not make them less dangerous. It makes the choice starker, to defend yourself without losing the small part of your humanity that is not yet extinct. This is not a plea for pity. This is an inventory and a warning. It is a map of the fault lines, and it is also a list of the tools we have left. Hold them like talismans. Learn them like prayers. And if you can, answer when I call another name into the dark. It's how we keep the map true. You hear me tonight because I turned the crank twice longer than I usually do, and because someone left a slice of battery tape on the terminal and the connection held. I'm saying this into the dark with my hands still smelling of oil and something coppery from splicing a coax cable that begged to be whole again. If the world were a clock, we are missing teeth. Every hour you live through, you nurse a new gap. This is the part where the gears catch and threaten to stop. Resources are tightening like a noose. I can feel it in the rhythm of my days. The barrels on the roof have given up another inch of water this week. That inch was the difference between a week's worth of stew and a handful of blanched roots. The solar rag we rigged in April, a patchwork of panels scavenged from a hospital and a diner, gives light enough to read by, but it stutters on cloudy days and under the weight of dust. Batteries lose capacity in the cold and sulk when overheated. Their moods are chemical and impatient. I learned to float charge them, to keep them at a gentle top-off so they don't sulk into sulfation. But even a well-maintained battery will die if fed only half measures. Food is equally petty and brutal. I have a list in the console of what I can trade. A jar of pickled beans, a whole loaf of flatbread once a month if I'm lucky, 3 tins of powdered milk scrounged from a church pantry last autumn. The rooftop garden produces a careful handful of greens, enough to add color to a meal, and not much else. Seed exchanges happen at dawn in the square 3 blocks over. People meet in 2s and 3s, pass seeds from hand to hand like contraband, an act of faith disguised as barter. If you have heritage seeds, you can make a future. If you don't, you make do with algae and scraped cereal. Fuel is the cruelest accounting. I have 1 jerrycan left and a half-can of diesel that is already smelling of varnish. I use it for the generator only when I will be broadcasting something that must be heard. Otherwise, I bicycle to trade points and carry my finds strapped to the frame. People who still drive have expensive lives measured in miles and risk. Roads are traps. Raiders learn to wait where the asphalt narrows and the trees crowd in. They learn to make false fires that look like caravans and then pull the rest of you into an alley to be emptied. Last month, a scavenger I trusted, a man with steady eyes named Tomas, told me about a convoy that had been ambushed a mile south of the overpass. He said the raiders wore red scarves and used whistles that mimic bird calls to confuse tracking dogs. He swore on his mother's name. I believed him. 3 days later, a box of canned peaches I'd been saving vanished from a crate outside the bakery. There are rules here that get rewritten quickly. Who can borrow, who can steal, who you can let inside your gate. I let a woman with a limp and a broken radiator valve inside once because she said she knew how to fix batteries. She fixed the batteries and left with the last of our soap. I do not pretend I'm immaculate in my judgments. The infected are a second thought problem that layered itself on top of the first. The nights are longer and their patience is strange. They've changed their tactics. What used to be mobs now move in ordered groups. They are learning to wait, to circle, to test a shelter's strength before committing. I only saw them up close once. They weren't howling shadows of legend. They were people who had been remade by something that looked like science and grief. There was a man in the group who hummed a lullaby as they passed a window, a song my grandmother used to sing. That song made me sick to my chest because it told me what used to be inside them. The threat is not just force. It is familiarity twisted into appetite. And then, 2 nights ago, something strange touched our frequency. It started as a note of music, a sound like a church bell tuned wrong, and then a voice that spoke coordinates. The voice was calm, like a radio operator reading from a log, and it said, Greenpoint, latitude blah, fresh water, safe harbor, repeat, Greenpoint. It repeated it 3 times and then the signal cut. People laughed on the feed at first, called it a joke, another story to keep the cold from getting into our bones. Then 3 caravans answered. 2 said they were within 40 miles and were converging. One was a woman who called herself Satine. She said she'd traded with a settlement that had a dam and a small desal plant, and that they had a way to test water. The 3rd caller, a man named Darrow, said only that he was bringing fuel and that the place was worth the trip. You watch how rumors travel in a shrinking world. Greenpoint became a sun in our small sky. Overnight the square filled with new maps folded and unfolded again. I went out at dawn and listened to the exchanges, the faces, the envy, the hope. A group of students from the university, kids with clean hands who still remembered chemistry, wanted to go. A pair of ex-military types volunteered to escort them for a fee. That's the calculus. Safety for a price, and sometimes the price is exacted in ways you don't anticipate. Part of me, the part that draws maps with sentences, wanted to call every line, every beacon, every radio and say, do not go. We do not know what Greenpoint is. The signal could be a trap, a bait to draw people into a perimeter that can be plundered and burned. Or it could be a real place. It could be desalination and gardens and a community that cracked the code on salt-tolerant barley. Maybe they have lawyers and libraries and sunlight stashed in glass houses. The hope slammed against my ribs like a fist, and I felt it hurt in the place where Elise's name lives. Trust is a luxury we ration. We have rules that are practiced like prayers. Do not answer unverified coordinates after dusk. Always check the caller's voice for background noises. Is there a child laughing, the clack of a generator, the echo of waves? A real place makes background sense. A fake place is too clean. I taught those rules to a kid who called himself Reed and who is 10 and stout and carries a small radio like a talisman. He taped a slip of paper into his shirt. Check the sound. He listened to the clip I played back from Greenpoint. The water in the background crooned low. Reed said it might be real. We prepared because that is what people do. We patched the antenna. We checked the spare can of diesel. We marked a rally point in case the caravans were ambushed. I traded a month's worth of airtime to the 2 students for a water testing kit. They promised to be careful. I felt better the way you feel better when you give a child a coat. It was a small purchase against the idea of doing nothing. Days passed. Boats, if you can call them that, moved on the horizon of our small world. A caravan of 3 sun-bleached trucks, a flat-top trailered by a man who smelled of engine grease, a bicycle train with panniers and children. Tonight those vehicles are visible blips in the logbook. Tomorrow they may be notes in an obituary. Trust and hope are not the only currencies. Paranoia and calculation pay equally. The military escorts asked for a list of supplies before they would guarantee passage. They wanted cigarettes, which are scarce enough to be considered currency, and the second of 3 spare tires from the bakery's trailer. In exchange, they promised route safety. I remember thinking, as I traded away a slightly cracked can of corned beef, that courage wears many coats. Sometimes it looks like giving up your best thing for someone else to wear. Inside me, the struggle is louder than my external calculus. Elise's face appears in the static more often these days. I find myself imagining what a place like Greenpoint would have meant to her. A pond where she could catch tadpoles. A greenhouse where she could plant the seeds for a tomato she named herself. I weigh the chance of reaching a sanctuary against the permanent erosion of the radio station if I leave. If I go north, who will tend the transmitter? Who will feed messages into the dark? If I stay, will the people who trusted me find Greenpoint without my voice? The radio tower is both a lighthouse and an anchor. It calls others and laughs in the face of silence. Leaving it feels like a betrayal of the map I promised to keep. Staying feels like surrendering the possibility of a future that is not just a series of careful days. We had a test run of the trust issue when the caravan that first announced its intent to go to Greenpoint stopped by 2 miles out. They had a boy who was fevered and a woman who used a hand for a splint. They wanted food and a favor, directions through the East Cut that avoids the broken highway where the raiders lie. I studied their hands, the way their nails were clean, the cadence of the woman's speech, the right pauses. I pointed them toward a safer route and gave them a tin of stew. They looked at me like I'd handed them life. 48 hours later, a different caravan rolled through, gaunt and suspicious, with an empty crate that used to hold peaches. The boy who'd been sick called in on a frequency and whispered that their group had been shadowed, probed with bird calls, and then taken in a way that left their spare kit missing. They thought they'd been duped. I thought about the route I'd suggested and calculated where traps could be laid. My gut, the only organ we have left that never lies, told me to stitch the radio log with warnings. I did. I broadcast in a measured way. Do not trust promises without background noise. I played back the woman's voice and asked anyone who spoke to her from other places to confirm. Static met my plea. Rumors are stubborn things. The caravans kept arriving, and with them came questions. Was Greenpoint a place, or was it a myth born of the human hunger for something bigger than a rooftop garden? Did the DeSalle plant exist, or was it an old corporate facility that had been repurposed and then abandoned? People chose their answers the way they choose seeds, hopeful, cautious, or plain desperate. Then the first exchange came back on the net. One of the student scientists called in with a high, thin excitement. They had water samples. It smelled like river water not mired in the ash of a fire. They had done an initial test. Conductivity low, contaminants under a threshold that made them dare to call it potable after treatment. They spoke of pipes and a pump, of a small community that had learned how to float a worn membrane to filter brackish water. The voice trembled. The voices that listened to tremor lean in. A dozen new plans were formed overnight in the square. People mapped routes by the positions of the sun and the angles of the wind. I kept the frequency warm and the generator breathing. But the world does not offer gifts without invoice. The same night the students reported their success, a radio operator on a different band called me and said he'd heard the Greenpoint coordinates and that he'd been listening for a week. He warned of lights in patterns, repeated 3 times, then a lull. That pattern, he said, is used by raiders to simulate a caravan signal. He told me the pitch measured in the background of the Greenpoint transmission had a mechanical hum like a generator on a trailer. That could be real, or it could be the echo of a trap. Decisions moved like teeth, slow, inevitable. This is where the tension crystallizes. People will travel because water is not a promise you postpone. People will take risks because their children drink stale, bitter water, or their mothers cough with dust in their lungs. People will choose hope over the radio's cautious voice, and sometimes that hope will be right. Sometimes it will be a trap. I sat on the roof and listened to every voice and held my hands over my knees like a man counting his pulses. Inside me, a ledger of obligations scrolled. 10 transmitter, keep frequency open, give the coordinates with caution, trade bread for fuel, never, ever answer a frequency that sounds too clean. But the ledger is porous. It leaks. Compassion seeps through like rain through a torn umbrella. Maybe that's the only thing we have left that's not bankrupt. So we prepare. We send a scout team to follow the caravan's tracks at a safe distance. We tape flags to trees at strange angles so we can see if anyone tampers with them. We rehearse a fake route, a decoy, and we plan an ambush against the ambushers because if you can think like a thief, you might stand a chance of countering one. We pack the radio with a message in case I must leave. Frequencies to check, the list of people who have traded with us lately, the location of the spare batteries. If I go, the recorded message will loop through the night. Be cautious, check tones, avoid the east cut, and for God's sake, protect the children. The night the caravans left for Greenpoint, I stayed up and took the shift with Reed. We listened as the engines receded and then fell silent. Reed asked me if I thought Greenpoint was real. I told him I did not know. He was 10 and he wanted the truth served plain. I said, truth here is a series of probabilities. We cut the dish and watched the stars the way old sailors used to when maps were everything. It was a small ritual. Hope balanced by radio checks, by rituals, by the memory of a girl who loved tadpoles and the honest geometry of seeds. Tomorrow the caravan will move out of sight if it has not been trapped. Tomorrow we will hear. The night is a long, patient animal, and we are small meat in its mouth. The tension is not a single moment. It is a taut wire we all feel in our teeth. I will keep the frequency warm. I will speak the coordinates and the cautions. I will teach the small sciences of water and battery care into the night, because that is how you make a map not of where we were, but where we might still go. If Greenpoint is true, it will change the map. If it is not, we will know the cost of being hungry for good news. Either way, the world is asking us to choose. Move with hope and risk, or wait and shrink until there is nothing left to protect. Reed fell asleep with the radio between us, and I thought of Elise and the small green of tomatoes. I thought of what it means to trust something beyond the reach of my 2 hands. The night is breathing. Somewhere a caravan creaks like a living thing. Somewhere else, a trap is set and waits for the horizon to fold. We are small, but we are not silent. We are mapping our fates with the thin wire of a broadcast. This is the part where tension builds until you cannot tell whether you will be saved by a place or swallowed by a plan. Either way, we will continue to tell the story until we are no longer able. You hear the tremor in my voice because my hands are shaking, and because I have been turning the crank longer than I should. I am telling you this now because what comes next will be a thing you either remember or you do not. This is the night where the map we drew with sentences gets redrawn with blood and machine oil. They reach Greenpoint by sunrise. That was the first good news. Headlights on the horizon, 3 rigs and a bicycle train, a ribbon of dust like a pale wound moving toward the harbor. The students called back on a shaky frequency. The DeSalle unit was real. It was a salvaged corporate drum, a belt the size of a caravan, a half-broken membrane someone had patched with duct tape and prayer. The water tasted metallic and true after a week of bitter sips and ash. People wept on the line. I broadcast the coordinates in a voice that tried not to tremble and told anyone within earshot to approach with caution, to check for traps, to move in groups, to watch for whistles. We should have been relieved. Instead, the air felt like a held breath. Caravans arrive and hope follows. Hope attracts everything else that eats hope. At noon, the first warning bit into the network. Darrow, you remember him, the man who smelled of grease, called in off frequency. He sounded like he was walking. Pattern, he said. 3 lights, 2 short, 1 long. In the background, a hum. Don't trust approach signals. They mimic convoy beacons. My stomach turned cold. That pattern matched what the other operator had said the Trapeco I'd told you about weeks ago. Raiders had learned to fake the signal, to simulate the cadence of a legitimate escort. They'd cut open a generator, set it on a trailer, and tuned the hum to sound like confidence. They threw up false lights to mimic windshield glows and used bird whistles to confuse dogs. Smart, patient, cruel. Predators who wore human faces. We debated. Reed wanted to go after the caravan with a group of kids. He thought the raiders would be scared by a band of children and might not attack. I refused. We posted watchers, we tied flags, we set false trails. But nothing can guarantee every person's choice in a world where thirst and fear rewrite the rules every day. Then the storm came from the north like a rumor turned monstrous. You remember the nights doubling in length. This storm was a different beast. It arrived with a wall of dark wind that smelled like iron. The weather didn't simply bring rain. It brought a pressure change that made the ground creak, a microburst that toppled weak trees, and a low, strange hush that stalled birds mid-flight. The kind of storm that makes mechanical things decide whether they will keep working. The kind that draws out the night and gives the infected time to move where they please. I tested the transmitter. The readings were ugly. The generator was throttling, the batteries were a tired orchestra, and the antenna's guy wire had frayed where metal had rubbed. If the tower fell in the gusts, the broadcast would die. If the broadcast died, the caravans moving toward Greenpoint would have no live signal to tell them the trap was bait and not harbor. If we did nothing, I could imagine a dozen people walking into a circle of men with whistles and a hollow promise of water. Choice narrowed like the end of a tide. Stay and try to amplify the signal so the caravans could find a safer route, which meant turning the generator to full and risking an overload that might ignite the fuel, damage the batteries, and maybe collapse the tower into a pile of glass and wire, or leave the station and go meet the convoy in person, which meant the transmitter would sit cold and silent, and whoever listened would lose a voice they trust. There was also a third, crueler option I refused to list. Do nothing and let probabilities decide. Elise's photograph in my pocket burned warm with the heat of a memory. She used to ask me when I'd stop being afraid of the dark. I had no satisfactory answer when she was small. Tonight, her face was a lever on my shoulder. I thought, if I can guide them through the storm, maybe more will live than die. If I leave the radio, maybe the network dies and more will die later. The choice thinned to a single question. Which thing could I trade for what? Courage, yes, but also time. I made a plan that was stupid and humane in equal measure. I would not move the station entirely. I would climb the tower in the gusts and splice the old coax into a makeshift directional, aim it north toward the caravan corridor, and run the transmitter on an emergency constant so that the signal would cut through the noise of the storm. It would eat batteries in a way that harmed them beyond repair. It would require me to be exposed on the tower in the worst of the wind. It might draw attention of friends and enemies, but it had a tactical advantage. A focused beam would make our frequency louder to those approaching from the right angle and quieter to tricksters pretending to be nearby. It might, in a small way, differentiate truth from performance. Reed wanted to come. I said no. He said then he would stay and watch the console. I saw his face harden like someone making a small adult decision. Keep it warm, Miles, he said. He sounded like my child, but braver. I handed him the hand crank, the spare flare, and the logbook. I told him to read names if he needed to remember why to keep the voice alive. He promised. Climbing the tower in a gale is a math of fear. Each step is a compromise between speed and caution. I wrapped my belt twice around a lattice rung, because my hands remembered how to tie knots a long time ago. The wind tried to unwrite everything. It took at least 3 tries for me to splice the coax because my fingers were numb and the wire frayed like old rope. Down below, a dog barked and then barked again, a sound that cut through the pressure of the storm like a small human refutation. The generator kept coughing and then settling into a slow, stubborn hum. Reed's voice came through the console steady. He read a name from the logbook, Marta Ray's Caravan 4. It felt like a benediction. I aimed the makeshift directional the way we aim a flashlight at a face, with the intent to be found. I cranked the generator up until the needle on the meter climbed into red. The batteries complained and echoed a chemical protest. I took a breath and keyed the mic. Listen to me, I said, and the words got swallowed once by static. The storm tried to make the message an artifact. I breathed harder and repeated it. This is Miles Harrington, frequency 103.1. Incoming convoy, 3 rigs and a bicycle line. Do not approach from the east cut. Repeat, avoid the east cut. Raiders mimic convoy beacons with 3 light patterns, 2 short, 1 long, and they use mechanical hums to simulate generators. Approach Greenpoint from the west along the riverbed. Keep lights low. Move in groups. Check for flags nailed to trees. Red ribbons mean sweep safe. White ribbons mean danger. If you hear bird whistles 3 times in close sequence, abort. I spoke with everything I had. My voice felt like a thin line stretched between two cliffs. The microphone warmed my lips. I repeated the coordinates. I played the student's water sample report back into the line, then the operator's warning about the mechanical hum. I gave over not only logistics, but a pattern of how to listen. Check background noise, listen for children laughing, listen for real engines, not the rhythm of a trap. The storm howled. The tower bent. Somewhere in the din, there was a change of sound where the infected moved like silk sliding across broken glass. I heard Reed scream, a sharp, animal shout, and I tasted copper. For a heartbeat, I thought the world had folded. Then a shape crashed into the lower guy wire with a sound like a body from another age. A creature, or a man changed by whatever we call the plague, swung at a crossbar and recoiled. The creature's breath smelled like decay and cold stormwater. Its eyes were bright with a hunger that is not measured in weeks, but in centuries. I had time enough to think only one small thought. They had learned to wait for the storm. I did what broadcasters have always done. I used my voice as a weapon and a shield. I pushed the transmission into a loop of instructions, and a voice that sounded like a human hand on a door. I sang too, a short jangle of a song that a child in the caravan knew, something patterned so it could be recognized by someone listening for a human line in a field of deceit. You learn to weaponize familiarity when you must. Movement answered. From the east came a scatter of lights that resolved into humans, the raiders attempting to set an ambush. From the west came another rhythm. Lights low, engine steady, someone humming off-key. The beam of the directional caught the convoy's receiver and, by the grace of geometry, made my voice louder to them than to the men with whistles. I watched the little blips on my handheld as they adjusted course. The caravan veered west. Someone shouted over the radio, and then there was a sound like relief and wept metal. The raiders realized the game had been ruined. They tried to mimic my loop with a recording they'd stolen, but loops are not the same as a live voice that can answer a question. They tried to bait the caravan with a fake distress call, a woman's voice crying for help with a background of waves. The caravan hesitated. My throat went raw. I threw every scrap of personal urgency I had into the mic. Do not stop. Do not respond to distress calls without verification. Move west now. The caravan moved. The lights dwindled to specks and then were swallowed by the horizon. Then the infected shifted. They were opportunistic and patient. Some had learned to follow mechanical hums. Others synchronized with the storm's microbursts and used the wind as cover. One of them climbed the tower like it wanted to cut the throat of our connection and did not feel fear. I met it with a crowbar I'd tied to my belt, and we fought there in the lattice with the rain hissing like 1,000 static needles. The creature struck at my forearm, and for a second I saw Mary's lullaby in its mouth. I hit it hard and the lattice squealed. Something, a wire or my weight, shifted. Sparks exploded like small constellations. The generator gave a final, ragged cough. I had minutes left. Minutes to set up a message that would continue if the tower fell. I recorded a short instructional loop, coordinates, cautions, the names of the caravans to be careful of, and I set it to repeat on low power. Then I gave the mic one last, full-blooded live plea and fed it into the loop. If you can hear me and you are the convoy, head west. If you are trapped and you can move, move now. If you are listening and you have seeds, bring them. If you are listening and you have hands, bring them. Protect the children. The tower shuddered and the directional snapped. The loop continued for a soundless, blessed minute before the batteries, old and chemically tired, heaved and died. The transmitter hiccuped and then was a thing of silence. I remember the moment the antenna fell because it sounded like an unmade promise. Reed's voice from below broke into a wail that could have been lost to the wind. I climbed down on hands raw and bleeding and found a caravan just at the edge of the square, 2 trucks, a bicycle, and a man with a child asleep on his shoulders. They'd answered the loop, moved west, and then circled back once they were sure the trap had failed. The students stood with a container of water between them. their faces gray with the weather of someone who has seen a miracle and is now thinking about the cost. We had saved some people tonight and perhaps damned others. That is the arithmetic of choices. The tower lay broken. The batteries were ruined. The transmitter would not warm again, not unless we had the time and the parts to rebuild, not unless the world stopped asking us to choose who to save. I am on the rooftop now, blood drying, radio quiet except for the memory of my own voice ringing in the empty console. I think of Elise calling to me from some unlit road that I never reached. I think of the caravan that kept driving because my voice told them to. I think about what it means to be a human who gives a map to other humans in a collapsing world. If we have saved lives, it was payment for what we let fall. If we have failed, then the ledger will keep the story. Either way, the night is older now, but not absolute. The storm will pass, and the world will still be this strange mixtape of ruin and small mercies. I am not a hero. I am a man who keeps a frequency warm until it's no longer possible. Tonight I warmed it with my body. Tonight I made a choice that cost me my station and gave others a chance to reach water. The radio is quiet now. Reed is binding my hand and humming, a human thing as if to stitch us both. The students have wrapped the DeSalle container in a tarp. The caravan will leave at dawn. I will try to repair what I can. I will keep telling the story because the story is the map, and without maps, we are only people wandering. If you heard my voice in the storm and you are moving, head west. If you heard it and you are listening now, keep your own maps ready. Keep your seeds. Keep your hands. I will speak again when I can. For now, I will breathe and count the names in my log and feel the hole in my chest where the station once sat like a small, patient heart. The night after the tower fell, the world felt both larger and emptier. The gust that snapped my antenna had taken more than metal and wire. It had taken a routine, a shape for my days. For years I'd measured the world by the warmth of that transmitter, by the way the console hummed under my palms and the needle settled when a voice came through. When it died, I realized the thing I mourned first was not the technology but the habit, the ritual that told me I was necessary. We counted heads at dawn. That was the practical start. Reed limped around with a strip of cloth tied to his wrist where glass had nicked him on the lattice. His face was thin, older in a way I didn't like to see. The students stood with the container of treated water between them like a relic. They'd wrapped it in an old tarp and kept watch all night. The caravan, the ones we'd guided west, had come back at first light, wheels soft with mud and hearts beat up by the storm. They left again with less fear and more cargo. A drum of diesel I'd traded for the sake of the radio, 2 sacks of barley, and a list of names. Some of those names were on the logbook I kept like a rosary. We read them aloud on the roof, each one a small prayer. Marta Ray's Caravan 4, Tomas, the boy who called himself Reed, who is no longer only a boy, the students who had wanted to change the world in small, bright ways. Saying the names held them a little more closely than the storm had the night before. Saying them was our first repair. We returned to the charred skeleton of the tower and inventoried what remained. The mast was twisted. A section of the coax had been sheared clean where a falling brace had hit it. The generator smoked faintly when you walked past. We had to siphon off the last usable diesel with a length of tubing and a prayer. Batteries, those faithful chemical lungs, were dead or sulked into memory. It would take parts we didn't have and a patient hand to rebuild. We sat and made lists, not poetry but logistics. Metal, a replacement antenna element, 3 new deep cycle batteries, a spare alternator if we could find one. A plan with numbers and distances attached to it. Some things mend quickly. Reed stitched my hand with a practiced, awkward tenderness borrowed from a boy who watched his mother do laundry. The caravan's mechanic, a woman who smelled like oil and cinnamon, tightened the last bolts I could reach. The students insisted on making tea and brought out a small tin of sugar that tasted like wealth. People worked the way folks in ruined cities work, with a fluid assumption that whatever was necessary could be learned, traded for, or scrounged. Other things do not mend so easily. My guilt is a blunt instrument that doesn't lend itself to spreadsheets. We'd saved a caravan and perhaps damned others. I could not know. There were names still missing from the logbook. A trader with a limp who never called back. A family that had never arrived at Greenpoint. A woman who had said she would meet her sister and then vanished. Every time I thought about them, a small part of me turned to ash. Hope arrived the next day in the form of practical news and small kindnesses. The students ran further tests on the DeSalle container. They found that with a handful of membrane repairs and a regular maintenance schedule, the unit could put out enough potable water to supply a small community if they organized a rotation and guarded the intake. It was not a miracle. It was a manageable engineering problem if people traded time for water instead of firing for it. That is the kind of hope I trust now. Not the sudden, shiny kind, but the slow, drab work of fixing things. Nature, oddly, seemed to be doing its own, indifferent work. The storm had stripped a layer of dust from the leaves in the garden, and one of the rooftop tomatoes had pushed open a stubborn blossom overnight. In the alley, a sapling that had been bent by the previous heat straightened a thought toward sunlight. Elsewhere, the storm had scoured a layer of ash into the river and washed salt into a low basin where frogs, small, stubborn things, had returned in slim numbers. There were places where the planet showed a bruised resilience. There were others where the damage was more final. A swath of pines downriver that had turned to toothpicks in a blaze months before, a feeder stream clogged with oil and char. The truth of the landscape is always plural, both healing and breaking at once. My internal weather changed as well. There was, for a while, a physical ache that had nothing to do with the cut on my arm. In the stripped-down hours of morning, when the generator was silent and the consoles looked like sleeping faces, I felt the weight of the choice I'd made. I had fed the transmitter until it died because the signal mattered more than the machine. I had given away the future heartbeat of my station for the immediate pulse of other people's lives. That choice lodged in me like a small stone. But the stone also taught me something, that being necessary is often messy. It is a ledger with both credits and debits. You save some and you lose some. What mattered was not arithmetic but fidelity, to the idea that we do not hoard our usefulness. I had kept the radio that way for so long because it made me central. Tonight I learned I could be useful outside of that center. Community altered shape in response. People who had once traded only for their own needs began to share tasks more honestly. The caravan who'd been guided west had kept its promise to share diesel. In exchange, they offered to scout farther than their original route and to look for the alternator a new radio would need. A small contingent decided to organize a rota to guard the DeSalle unit at Greenpoint. The students proposed a plan to replicate the membrane system with scavenged parts and to teach others how to maintain it. In the square, there were more faces with hands willing to learn the small crafts it takes to keep life moving. Soldering, water testing, seed saving. I felt a strange revision of identity. I had been a voice. Now I was the man who had risked the voice for others. I was still a broadcaster at heart, but broadcasting no longer meant only speaking into a console. It meant teaching Reed to recognize the sound of a real generator, helping a student patch a membrane, laying out a grid of flags in the trees so travelers could read a map at night. My role expanded because I had been forced to expand it. It was ugly and necessary and full of work. There was grief, too, ritualized and human. We held a small, improvised memorial on the first night after the storm, not for heroes but for certainty. We lit a candle in a lantern and passed it from hand to hand, each person offering a name, someone they had lost to the cold, to the raiders, to the long nights that changed people. It was less a ceremony and more a shared acknowledgement. That counts for a lot. Reed read a child's name and then, in a voice small and trembling, begged the world to be kinder. It was enough to make the rest of us stop pretending we were not raw. Practicalities arrived like patient beasts. We scouted for parts on the edges of town, trading hours and signatures for bolts, and a section of copper pipe that might be turned into an antenna. We bartered a ration of sugar for a set of weather seals. The caravan left with a promise to return with a spare alternator in 2 weeks if they found one. That promise was conditional and fragile. In the meantime, I patched what I could and rewired the console to accept a smaller, hand-cranked transmitter. A far cry from the tower, but portable and useful in its own right. If the wind took us again, we could still speak, even if only in whispers. The cost of the choice remained. The tower would not stand again without metal and time I could not conjure alone. I thought, in the private geography of my mind, of packing up and heading to Greenpoint with the caravan, to see the DeSalle unit, and perhaps volunteer as radio maintenance in a place with a future. There was a temptation to leave the ruin and travel toward the promise. But then I thought of the map I had been maintaining in people's minds, a thread of guidance across the dark. Who would keep it warm if I left? Reed could, perhaps. The students could. There was now a small cohort that knew how to listen and to repeat. I would not be the only link in the chain, so for now I stayed. I rebuilt in small measures. I taught Reed how to splice a coax properly, how to wind a coil, how to read the background noise of a real generator. We set up a rota for the console. Reed would watch the nights and the students would rotate day checks. We recorded the lessons into a worn recorder, a small survival archive. How to filter water step by step, how to check for sulfation in a battery, how to check the pitch of a generator hum. The archive was not poetry. It was a manual for the living. In the evenings, when the repaired tea tasted like a victory and the conversation settled into the soft geography of neighbors, we played the old records the caravan had left behind. The music stitched us in a way the radio could not that week. People sang along off-key. Children chased each other with ribbon flags. It was small. It was fragile. It was, I realized, everything we could claim as a kind of victory. Nature's script kept being ambiguous. Rain came again in gentler sheets a week later, coaxing more green from the rooftop garden and filling the DeSalle plant's intake with less brackish water. But farther downstream, new scars bled into the riverbed where an industrial spill had leached compounds that turned frogs' belly up. The world was not recovering evenly. It was not a plot with a satisfying arc. It was a conversation of elements, sometimes cooperative and sometimes spiteful. In my journal, a small thing of pages that I write into with a stub of pencil, I wrote one sentence and rewrote it until it read like a compass. Keep the voice, but do not be the voice. That balance became my instruction. I would keep speaking when I could, but I would also teach others to speak. I would be part of a network instead of an island of sound. The sacrifice of the tower had taught me how much could be shared. It had shown me that the map of survival must be mutual if it is to last. So the aftermath settled into a new routine. Repair, teach, guard, trade, mourn, and plant. We measured recovery in small metrics. A working membrane, a repaired alternator, a baby's cough abating with antibiotics. We had hope that was practical and brittle. We had grief that was blunt and honest. We had each other, which was both a tool and a threat. The radio stayed quiet that week, but not empty. Reed kept vigil and now knew how to warm the transmitter enough to send a message short and clear. The loop I'd recorded in the storm would play for a little while on borrowed battery life before the device itself went dark. That was all right. The point had been made. A voice could change a direction. The rest would be the work of people who kept showing up. If you ask me now whether things were better or worse after the tower fell, I will tell you this. Both. We had saved lives and broken a machine that had been my center. We had water and a plan for maintenance, but we also had a longer list of parts we could not procure. The world continued its double movement of healing and harm. The choice I made a small arc of salvation possible and left a long ledger of repair in its wake. At night, I still sit on the roof and listen. The sky is bruised, yes, but sometimes a star tries to be stubborn. I know now that my duty is not to be the only light, but to be the match that helps others carry torches. The station taught me that you can burn bright for a moment to point the way. Then you teach someone else how to light a candle, and the room grows safer. We will rebuild the tower if we can. If we cannot, we will walk and speak and plant seeds and teach others what we learned with our hands. That is the promise I make in ink and in blood. To keep the map true as long as my hands will still splice wire and my voice will still rasp into the night. You hear the scrape of a chair as I lean forward, because the microphone makes everything intimate, and because the night has an appetite for distance. This is the part where the story tightens to a knot, and I have to decide what to hand you before the broadcast goes quiet. I'll try to be honest. I'll try to be small and useful. We did something in the storm, something messy and human. We pulled a caravan out of a trap. We kept a desal unit alive long enough for a town to breathe, and we lost a tower that had been the shape of my days. That is the ledger, debt and credit balanced by messiness. The people who are alive because of what we did will carry seeds, barrels, and names across the land. The people who were lost will live in my pocket like stones. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. Hope feels like something you can hold and also something that will cut you if you hold it too tightly. After the tower fell, hope arrived as membranes and wrenches and a rota for the water intake. The students who figured out the desal system did not bring salvation in the way the old sermons promised. They brought a plan and a willingness to keep working. That plan is smaller than you want when you are thirsty, but it is also more durable. Practical hope is stubborn. It grows in the places people decide to show up. The world is not getting suddenly better. The sky is still bruised. The nights still stretch. Raiders still plan and the infected still move through shadows. But there are patches where life insists on being possible. A tomato pushed a blossom on my rooftop this week. It was a small, obstinate thing, nothing to governments or maps, but enormous if you know how rare a blossom can be in a time like this. We share those small things the way sailors share a lamp. They are proof that the planet can still make green if you give it half a chance. What changed inside me after all this is not heroism. I did not grow a backbone of iron. I grew a tolerance for ambiguity. I learned that usefulness is not always dramatic. You do not have to set the world right to be worth anything. You can teach a kid how to splice wire. You can show a woman how to test her water and tell her to boil it twice. You can sit with someone whose hands are shaking and say their name aloud until their pulse slows. Those are the acts that stitch communities back together, and I now measure my days by them. The station, such as it was, taught me a final thing. Voices survive better when they are many. I used to think my role was to be the single warm place in a cold world. The tower taught me I could be a match for others to carry torches. Reed keeps the small transmitter now. The students recorded the maintenance lessons into a battered recorder. We wired our knowledge into objects because paper rots and people remember longer when they hear an instruction twice. Nature is both kinder and crueler than I want it to be. The storm cleaned dust from leaves and seeded a few gullies with silt that will take root if the next rains are gentle. In other places, things keep falling apart. Pipelines leak into riverbeds and leave long, silent scars. Recovery is not a straight line. It is 2 steps forward and 3 back, and also a sprout pushing through asphalt. We will make progress in the small measures and mourn the rest. So what do we do now? We plant what we can. We barter our skills as well as our goods. We keep a ledger of trust and review it every morning. We teach each other the nuts and bolts of living. How to check a battery for sulfation, how to make a charcoal filter, where to split a seed packet so 2 families can try a planting. We make lists and then we break them into doable things. We send scouts, not for conquest but for parts. We teach children how to read the pitch of a generator so they can tell a real human hum from a recorded lie. My final message, and I want to say it as simply as possible, is this. Protect the small things. Protect the children, yes, but also protect the seeds, the spare bolt, the recorder with maintenance notes, the ritual of naming. These are the things that persist when institutions do not. Protect your ability to tell and to listen. Trade generously but not blindly. Check the background noise on any signal you are given. When someone promises you a harvest or a haven, ask 3 questions. Who benefits? Who guards it? And what do they ask in return? If someone asks for your last can of food in exchange for a promise, treat the promise as currency that can be measured. Is it repeatable? Is it witnessed? Is it recorded? Not everything that sounds like hope is hope. Some of it is bait for the desperate. I do not have words of grand certainty. I have the plain policy of a radio man who has learned from failure. Keep your frequency low and your community louder. Speak plainly and often. Teach others what you know before you need it more than they do. Love the people who will dig ditches for you when the time comes, and be the person who will dig for others when they need you. Leave instructions taped to your console. Share your tools. Protect the water. There will be more storms. There will be nights where you think the dark will never end. There will be people who will act as if scarcity gives them permission to be cruel. There will also be those who will, for no good reason except that their hearts are stubborn, give you a loaf or a bandage or a name. In the long view, the small kindnesses add up. They are the architecture of a future we can build, one brick at a time, with hands that are bruised and patient. If you're listening now and you are at another station, keep your frequency warm. If you're a caravan on the road, check your background noise and your flags. If you are someone with a membrane or a wrench, teach someone else how it works. If you have a child who laughs at small things, keep them laughing as long as you can. Laughter is a kind of weather we cannot afford to lose. I will sign off now, not because I am finished, but because the night expects a pause. Reed is watching the small transmitter. The students are drafting a parts list we can trade for, and the caravan leaves with jars of water and an oath to return when they can. We will rebuild what we can and teach what we must. We will plant tomatoes and hold memorials and argue about which batteries are worth the risk. This is Miles Harrington on frequency 103.1. Keep your seed packets wrapped, your spare wire hidden, and your names written in a place you can find them by touch. Keep your voices together. Keep your hands ready. Good night. Keep the light you can.